It's a pleasure to be here speaking today. I'm going to share my screen. First, I talk a bit about measuring child poverty. Seems boring, but in reality, it's a big problem for our country because the way we measure child poverty really underestimates the number of poor children tremendously, and I'm going to try to just focus on that a bit. So this is the official child poverty rates in our country. You can see that this is the latest, just released in September, but reflecting 2019. As you can see, children everybody's been decreasing in poverty for the last 6 or 7 years. Children are at 14.4%, but they're still the poorest group in our society. You can see that seniors are less than 10%. This is another way of looking at poverty, the supplemental poverty measure, and this is improved because it doesn't measure based on a thrifty food budget in 1963, but actually looks at actual expenses for shelter and food and clothing that families have, and also gives credit to government programs that help them, such as earned income tax credit, SNAP, etc. So it gives us a clearer picture of where they are. And you can see here, children are at 12.5%, but in fact, neither of these really reflect the true level of poverty in our country. Of course, there are racial ethnic disparities, as you can see here. Black children are 32% of them are poor, and Latinx children are 26% poor, and white children are 11% poor. The gap, however, is worse than that, because if you look at wealth or assets, and this is how much a family has in assets to tide them over in bad times, you can see that white non-Hispanic families have about 10 times the assets of Black or African American or Hispanic and Latino families. And this has been particularly problematic during the COVID pandemic, when families have had their economic floor ripped out from underneath them, and Black and Hispanic Latinx families really don't have the cushion to protect them in these times. You can see that if you're looking also at different levels of poverty, and if you at each level, children, people under 18, are the poorest group in our society. Something is wrong with that picture, I think. And if you look at those under 200% of poverty level, about 35% of children are poor. Now, what does a family need to survive, really? And there's something called a basic needs budget, or a living wage, if you're looking at their actual wage. And you can see here that across the states, even in Mississippi, which is the poorest state that we are showing here, the living wage of a family of 4 is $50,000. It's not $26,000, which is the official poverty level. And of course, in states like California and New York, it could be $80,000. So if you looked at children living in families that make less than those kinds of figures, you're really talking about many more children than we're counting. And all of these kids are in economic risk. This looks like another way of looking at this. This is food insecurity. Again, you can see below 100% poverty, 46% of children are poor, but even between 100 and 200% poverty level, a third of children are insecure, food insecure. And it's only when you get above 200% poverty that you start to lower the level of food insecurity in families that are low income. This looks at ACEs, adverse childhood events. There's a lot talked about these ACEs, their negative impact on children. Briefly, I'm just going to show you the level of ACEs related to poverty. Again, you can see there's really a linear relationship between the number of ACEs children experience and their poverty level. And in fact, it's really not until about 400% of the official poverty level that children get down to about 9.7%, about 10% experiencing ACEs. This is the latest from
Dr. Dreyer?
Yes.
If I could just pause for a second. We have a quick question about what ACEs are. Could you just give the explanation again of what ACEs are?
Yes, of course. I actually took out that slide because I thought we didn't have time. But so ACEs are adverse childhood events such as divorce, death of a parent, incarceration of a parent, witnessing domestic violence, being a victim or a witness to neighborhood violence, living with somebody mentally ill or with alcohol or drug use, experiencing racism, and of course, poverty itself is an ACE. So those are the ACEs, and they've been shown to really cause toxic stress in children, really severe stress that impacts their brain development and changes their reaction to their emotional reaction to a variety of things that stress them, and also causes them to have poor academic performances.
Okay, so thanks. For
viewers, I'll just go back to this to show that
sure.
These are all the ACEs without poverty, to show that at different poverty levels, how many of the other ACEs kids have.
Okay, so
And,
for viewers, for viewers out there, if you have a quick question like that, like about a definition, you can shoot it to us through the Q&A, and I'll try to work it in. But mostly, we'll wait until.
Yeah, and I'm happy to clarify anything as we're going through. So thank you. This is looking at what families make at the poverty level. So this is looking at 2020 federal poverty levels. So you can see a family of 4 at 100% of the poverty level is making $26,200. I've just showed you slides which shows that most families need at least $50,000 to just barely get by. And you can see that the $52,400 figure there is at 200% of the federal poverty level. So in general, we feel that at least 200% of the federal poverty level is needed for families to simply make do, not to go to movies, not to go on vacations, just to get food, shelter, clothing, and cover their expenses. I just want to mention before we get to other impacts, the issue of family homelessness. Family homelessness is a huge problem in our country. 1 in 50 children are homeless annually. 1 in 45 children, 1 in 30 children are homeless annually right now. So that this is increased from 2006 to 2013 hugely. And homelessness impacts children negatively in multiple ways, including interfering with their development, with their education, and of course, other issues. And this is purely a problem of poor children. So what is the impact of poverty on child health? This looks at infant mortality. Infant mortality is the children's death rate in the first year of life. That's on the left on those white bars. And I just want to point out, it's just for briefly looking at that, those obviously in low poverty versus medium versus high poverty, you can see the climbing rates of infant mortality. There are also, just like with poverty, there are infant mortality inequities by race, ethnicity. You can see that Black children have a much higher rate, more than twice as high rate of infant mortality than white children do. American Indian, Native Hawaiian or Alaskan natives are all at very high rates compared to white children. Hispanic or Latinx children do somewhat better than these other groups, still are somewhat higher than white children. This looks at low birth rate, which is another problem, the health problem that causes lifelong problems for kids, and its relation to income and poverty. And just if you look at the left column, this is comparing the US, UK, Canada, and Australia, but just first to focus on the United States, you can see that the top, the bottom quintile of income has almost 2.5 times the incidence of low birth weight than the top income quintile. And of course, just compared to other countries like the UK, Canada, and Australia, we do worse at every quintile of income. So in thinking about health, a term called double jeopardy was coined a number of years ago, which is that poor children suffer from double jeopardy because of the issue of poverty plus their other insults to their health. But in fact, it's really an actual pile-on of multiple jeopardies. So there's increased low birth weight, as I pointed out, impacting neurodevelopment. There's increased chronic diseases such as asthma. There's increased accidental injury. In fact, mortality from accidental injury is hugely higher in poor children. There's poorer access to healthy foods and to safe and healthy play environments. I already mentioned homelessness and substandard housing. Of course, government neglect and incompetence. So all of these are a Venn diagram of disadvantage for poor children. One last point about this I want to make is that the health effects of poverty last into adulthood. So this is a graph that looks at the ABC Darien project, which is a project that improved early childhood development and brain development in poor kids. And this particular slide looks at those that were in the control group versus those of the intervention group, and shows a much higher rates of these health problems such as obesity, high blood pressure, metabolic syndrome, which is a severe type of derangement due to obesity and high blood pressure together. And you can see that in those poor children that didn't get the intervention, these high rates of these adult health problems were the result 30 years later. There are many studies looking at the long-term effects, health effects of poverty in children, especially those growing up in poverty in early childhood and long-term poverty. So this brings us to what could we be doing about this? One thing I just want to mention is that 2013, the AAP added poverty and child health to its strategic agenda for children. It's still there, and came out with a policy in 2016 when I was president of the AAP that recommended pediatricians to screen for the social determinants of health, connect families to communities, but also very strongly recommended that the government decrease child poverty through various government programs. Which brings us to the roadmap to reducing child poverty. As you heard from Chris, I was one of a very distinguished, I always felt I was the least distinguished of the group that wrote this report. on reducing child poverty, but it was an honor to be part of this group. And this group came really from the AAP's call to action, as well as congressional funding from a number of our forward-thinking Congresspeople. So how does poverty cause these bad child outcomes? We feel in general it's through two pathways, the investment pathway and the stress pathway. So the investment pathway is pretty obvious. Poor families cannot provide their kids with the books, with the experiences, with the good preschools, with the museum trips, with the tutors that they may need, etc. And the stress pathway is that poor families are under such stress that they can't nurture their kids in the way that they would like to nurture them because they have too many other problems to deal with. I always say that when you can't get food on the table, it's hard to read Goodnight Moon to your little child. It's just, you're really worrying about whether they have enough food to eat. And both of these impact child outcomes. And these are often educational and academic outcomes that have lifelong effects on these kids, as well as emotional trauma for the children at the same time. So we looked, as I've already alluded to, many things that are associated with poverty that clearly cause bad outcomes. Low birth weight, infant mortality, homelessness, etc. All the things I've just been talking about. But we also spend a lot of time looking for causal evidence. These are evidence about the impact of poverty that are based on actual experiments. Most of these are experiments that were actually natural experiments, such as rollout of a new program that increased the income of families. And here you can see a number of the programs that we studied to look at their impact on child poverty: earned income tax credit, welfare to work programs, tribal government supplemental income and natural experiments when casinos were opened up on reservations, and SNAP or food stamps and the outcomes due to roll out increases of food stamps over time. And I'm not going to go through all of each of these individual issues, although I'm happy to address them in questions. But basically, the weight of the causal evidence indicates that poverty itself causes negative child outcomes, especially when poverty occurs in early childhood or persists through a large portion of childhood. Meaning, it's not just that the parents have low education. It's not just that the parents, that the mother is a single mother, a single parent. It's really the actual lack of money that the family has. Money matters to child outcomes, both in their academic outcomes as well as their health. And also we show that many programs that alleviate poverty, either through directly providing income transfers such as the earned income tax credit, or by indirectly by providing food, housing, or medical care, including Medicaid, which Joan Alker is going to be talking about, have been shown to improve child well-being. We looked at all these individual programs and how much they decrease child poverty. So you can see that the earned income tax credit itself decreased child poverty by almost 6%, and food stamps about 5% decrease in poverty. In red, that's the decrease of the poverty level. Altogether, without all these programs, child poverty rates would be at least 8.5% to 9% higher. So I usually say, many people say the war on poverty didn't work, and that's not true. The war on poverty did work. We just stopped increasing the amounts in the early 70s and never kept up with the levels of poverty that people are existing. But without the existing government programs, there'd be many more poor children, many more poor children with poor outcomes. We looked at a variety of policy options. Our goal was to come up with a solution to reduce child poverty by 50%. That was what we were asked to do. And you can see here, the green parts of the bars are the reductions in child poverty. That longitudinal line in the middle is our goal. And you can see that none of the individual programs reach that goal, but of all of those, a child allowance came closest. And right now, we would recommend that a child allowance, which is actually a completely refundable and beefed up child tax credit, would be the best single program to start to reducing child poverty. Right over there. We came up with 4 policy and program packages. I'm not going to go into these in too much detail, but basically one package was looking at work-oriented programs, so earned income tax credit, because it not only gives people money, but it encourages work. Expanded child care tax credit to allow people to have daycare, increase in the minimum wage, etc. And this actually decreased poor children, but really less than 20%. It was very cheap, however, and only cost about $9 billion a year. We next looked at a sort of a medium level program, which looked at the earned income tax credit and an expanded child care tax credit and a low level of this child allowance that I talked to you about. And that decreased child poverty by almost 40%, about 40%, and cost about $45 million. And then we looked at 2 programs which combined programs either by increasing housing vouchers and SNAP, or in the far right by beginning a supercharged child allowance and reducing immigration eligibility restrictions in addition to earned income tax credit and help for daycare. And both of these made the mark of reducing child poverty by 50%, as well as those in deep poverty by 50%. Deep poverty being those children living in less than 50% of the poverty level, who are the poorest of the poor. And both of these also increased the number of low-income workers, so they didn't discourage work. But the annual cost was pretty hefty, $90 to $109 billion. I just remind everybody that there are very good estimates that child poverty costs us about $800 billion to $1.1 trillion a year in extra costs in medical care, in education, in prisons, etc., in loss of economic outcomes as adults. But so 100 billion is actually, of course, we're now used to trillions of dollars for COVID relief. So I think 100 billion doesn't sound as much as it did about a year ago when we first put this out. I'm going to stop here because I want to turn this over to Joan and get us to be talking. If you want to learn more about the child poverty report, it's available free. You can go to www.nap.edu/25246. But if you put in Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty in Google, you will get it, and the PDF is available for free. you.